Great, thanks for the introduction, Maggie. I'm Jeremy. I am pleased to be here with you all and present some of the research that I conducted about a year ago for my doctoral dissertation. I think there'll probably be some other folks joining us. At maybe some point would love to learn as to what folks' interest in this session is, whether it's just about research or methods or perhaps the content or the findings. So I'll visit that maybe at the end. I'll share about some of the research that I've done and then perhaps check in with folks. But I'm appreciative that you're here. Research is always fun to present and share, and that's the whole purpose of it, is dissemination of that. So thanks for inviting me. So I have this fun PowerPoint that I'm going to share a bit about it. If you perhaps want me to slow down in a particular section or speed up to get to certain things, please let me know. Like, I'm open for the formative feedback as we go through it. Again, I'm curious as to what you all would like to know about it. My research topic was, the title is kind of a mouthful, Confluences of Leadership and White Privilege, and exploring consciousness of self with student leaders, and white student leaders in particular. And really, I highlighted the middle part of that title because that's the concise way of describing it, is that it's merging leadership and white privilege to have an understanding of how a racial identity, a privileged racial identity, influences leadership development with students. So just a real quick overview of what the presentation contains. I'll afford a few minutes to provide an overview of the study and just zip through some of the existing scholarship that there is on the topic. I'll discuss the data collection and design and the execution of my study, and the bulk of the time I'll be sharing my findings and discussing their implications. And perhaps if we have time, like the cherry on top will be my reflections as a researcher in this study. And just a little bit about myself, because the nature of my study, I think it's important to share that. I work full-time in student affairs. I work at the University of Wyoming. I have had a stint at CSU before. I did my master's degree there in the Sahi program, like almost 15, 20 years ago. So I would be a little old, but definitely love working in the region and miss CSU. My current position at the University of Wyoming is a director of the Center for Student Involvement and Leadership. And so I work with a number of different units to foster engagement opportunities, but also showcase leadership and help cultivate that within students at that institution. So just a brief overview. Leadership development is interesting. It's an expectation both within and outside of higher education that institutions are cultivating these skills amongst students. And it's also an expectation of employers of college graduates. They want to see students who have leadership skills. So in a recent survey conducted by NACE, 68% of employers indicated that they're looking for these talents amongst graduates. They also indicated this like ambiguous term in that survey too, that they are seeking candidates for their employment opportunities who contain intercultural fluency. And that's a bit of a nebulous term that I think reflects the ability of college graduates to be able to navigate increasingly diverse workplaces. And then the problem that is presented by this is that university curriculum is often deficient in both of these areas, and leadership skill development, and also that nebulous concept of intercultural fluency. Leadership education usually stresses knowing yourself to become a better leader. And often in that self-examination and self-monitoring, race is conspicuously absent from leadership education. Scholars have really started to dig into the relevance of race and leadership development, especially among students of color. And new models are emerging for people of color. to develop leadership skills in relevant ways. Yet, existing conventional leadership models are still lacking any focus on racial identity. White students often need to develop these racially informed leadership skills to become a better leader in an increasingly diverse workforce. Also, they need to have awareness of what their privilege means in these contexts too. So if this topic continues to go unaddressed, where white students aren't thinking about their race and leadership, it essentially constitutes another form of white privilege. And a lot of scholars critique researching white privilege because it gives additional undue attention to white students, when historically the tomes of student affairs and some of the foundational leadership models that we have are all based on white and often male student populations. However, if we ignore this element of it, it constitutes another form of white privilege, and it deserves some study. So that's why I took up some of this research. Some of the research questions that I had, I wanted to explore how white student leaders made meaning of their racial identity through a leadership framework. And a leadership framework was somewhat of an entry point to be able to have hard conversations about racial identity and privilege associated with that. So I had 3 research questions reflective of my research design, which sought to explore this. First, I wanted to learn the narratives of white student leaders and what they tell about leadership just in general. Then I wanted to uncover some of the narratives about their racial identity that they tell themselves and others. And then the third research question really was focused on making the meaning of their white privilege through a leadership framework. So in other words, how does white privilege, if at all, influence their leadership style? Now, the study design, I'm going to talk about the methodology in just a second if you like to geek out on that stuff like I do. But the design is really like a scaffolding approach in this framework. So I structured a series of 3 meetings that have increasingly complex and intense conversations. So the first explored leadership, then race, then the integration of those two. And leadership was used first because it's that entry point to the conversation. It was the way that I could draw some student leaders in to talk about racial identity. And by having it become increasingly complex and intense, we built a capacity as a group to be able to discuss things later on. So some of the existing scholarship that was out at the time that I completed this study, and things have changed certainly in the last year or so on scholarship. I won't spend too much time on this, but I think it's important to understand. I examined student leadership models to see where those gaps that I mentioned before of racial influence were. I looked at a lot of the core components of white identity and privilege and to know how students might process these different concepts. I reviewed existing studies on whiteness and college students to help inform the research design, and I provided us and examined a social change model, in particular the concept of consciousness of self, to use as a framework for the study. And this is all in an effort to understand the confluences between white identity and leadership. I don't know if you've used this tool before. This is like a handy dandy thing that my advisor provided me in my doctoral studies to be able to synthesize some of the literature. It's this reverse triangle where you distill some of the research by kind of merging different concepts. I just wanted to share this tool in case you haven't come across it before, and mention that the product of this synthesis really helped inform the design of the research, assisted in my analysis, so I came back to that, and was really referenced in the results. And then you may have gathered by now, but I had a design that allowed me to meet and solicit the stories of some of the students involved. And that was coupled also with my own epistemological perspective to help inform that research design. So personally, I really align with constructivism and employed that in this study. I very much enjoy that, to be part of it as a participant, but also as a research. And each layer of the methodology was chosen to examine this topic, leading to a method through narrative inquiry called caucusing. And caucusing hasn't been used a lot in research. It's a newish method. There's a few studies out there that do exist employing it, but it essentially gets students together and focuses on a singular identity. So because it's newer, I wanted to dig into that just a little bit. It exclusively focuses on the social identity of a particular participant in that selection criteria. And so some of you may be aware of caucusing as it's used in co-curricular programs or social justice workshops, where you gather folks of that shared identity to dig a little bit deeper into it. And you can use it with both privileged and marginalized identities. I did find one research study that did use caucusing in New Zealand, where in order to examine the historical impact of colonialism, the class divided up based off of Indigenous or non-Indigenous identities to be able to have a shared understanding to explore that topic. And so I employed a similar thing with these white student leaders in that they had to have a shared white identity, so self-identify as white, be traditionally aged, be full-time enrolled at the institution. So caucusing brought these folks together. The other difference of caucusing is that it's directive and it's sustained dialogue on that identity, which is really helpful for exploring privileged identities when folks might want to shy away, talk about perhaps one of the marginalized identities that they share. This enables a researcher and a facilitator to be able to bring that conversation back. So I'll give you an example. As we were caucusing, sometimes gender came up as a topic, and folks really wanted to go down like how they may have shared a marginalized identity when it comes to gender. And as a facilitator, I would bring the conversation back to their white identity as a privileged identity to explore. So caucusing is really helpful for exploring sensitive issues when focus groups sometimes doesn't allow that directive or perhaps invasive facilitation of discussion. So in this format of caucusing, I had a co-facilitator who actually worked at CSU, so it was nice to have some help and from someone from a different institution that the students were not familiar with. Met with 4 participants in 3 separate meetings that lasted an hour each. And to be honest, like we probably could have spent many more than just 3 hours talking together, but as student leaders, their schedules were super packed. And participants in the study were selected through purposive selection, similar to that criteria that I mentioned. It wasn't random. I was purposely seeking the people who had some of those identities, and it required folks to self-identify as white, student leader, and be traditionally aged. Other criteria wasn't selected. While it would have been fascinating to kind of understand some other identities and how that influences, that wasn't the purpose and design of the study, because we really wanted to narrow in on those 2 particular identities, leadership and being white. And as you can imagine, probably the greatest challenge in this study was actually recruiting participants. It was challenge. I did a lot of challenging. I did a lot of reflection to figure out what might be the best method of getting students to self-opt into a study that explores these really difficult, messy conversations. And after a lot of reflection and failure in some instances and trying to recruit students, I found that being bold and direct was really the best avenue to not dance around the topic, but to be like, I'm looking for students who are willing to talk about these things. And in the interest of time, I'll acknowledge that recruitment taught me a lot about just this topic in general. And also, just because students self-select into a study like this doesn't mean that they are woke and they've arrived at a racial awareness that incorporates their privilege. The participants who self-opted into this truly had some work to do and represented some interesting concepts. So data collection, it was completed at Frontier State University. That's a fictional name for an institution in the Rocky Mountain region. It was a 4-year public institution with less than 15,000 students. I think the more intriguing thing about this, that it was conducted at an institution that is rural and conservative, and that sociopolitical dynamic, I think, is important to keep in mind when looking at some of the results. It also was a predominantly white institution where over 70% of the student body was white. Actually, I'm going to go back real quick. The reason I selected Frontier State University as a moniker for this research site is that the word frontier is often associated with white settlement and the implications of white dominance. And so it's very intentional to align that and kind of have that represented in the study. So my data collection was collected through video recording and then transcribed using audio and watching the video. So I saw much of the data multiple times. I was really nervous about collecting some of the data in video recording, but it helped me immensely in analysis because I could look at the body language of the participants, and when someone might be challenged, kind of see how they responded, not just verbally, but non-verbally. And I used narrative analysis to identify the themes that are pertaining to some of the characters and plots and some of the stories that these white student leaders provided. And then I used longitudinal coding to determine how their thinking changed over the course of the study, over those 3 meetings that we had. And as a side note, I was somewhat fortunate that this study was conducted almost exactly a year ago, right before the pandemic went into full swing. So thankfully, I was able to get much of the research done, and which enabled us to have our meetings in person and be able to have that dynamic that's kind of hard to capture via Zoom now. So in any constructivist study, I think it's really important to acknowledge where the story begins, and that's with the participants, with these 4 white student leaders who chose to be part of this study. Apollo, he was the only male or queer identified individual in the study, and his presence was mellow, but his vibe was really edgy compared to the overall campus vibe of Frontier. Lauren, she was country through and through, so boots and horses and conservative beliefs, but probably one of the sweetest participants there too. She almost had a Southern vibe, although she was from the Rocky Mountain region. Quinn was bold and achievement-oriented, not a stereotype of Greek culture, but certainly a strong Greek leader. And when people probably think of student leadership, Riley would be the student who comes to mind. Outgoing, inviting, very passionate. And it represented several different areas of student leadership on campus, so they didn't all come from the same organizations. And they only had a few commonalities. Most of them did not know each other prior to the study. These students, over the course of the 3 meetings that we had for research, would form a community in a few short meetings and eventually wanting to hang out with each other after the study. So demographic information was collected, but only after the study was completed to prevent it from influencing any discussion or distracting from the focus of it, which was the white identity. And as you may notice here, they came from a variety of varying backgrounds and majors. There's only 1 male who participated. I recruited 3 seemingly male individuals, though, for this study, and only 1 showed up. And so that's kind of interesting. It's hard to make a conclusive statement about that as it pertains to unpacking privilege. Only one of the people provided me a reason for their absence of those 3 other folks that were recruited, but I think it's still notable. Another thing that's worth noting is you can observe the lack of first-year students in here. Everybody else was from a different year level. And this is not a product of recruitment. I purposely sought first-year leadership organizations and recruited there, and again, was unable to get participants from it. I think that there's a lot of interesting things in these demographics, but I won't go too deeply into it. But you can see like there's different political affiliations, different majors, like a spectrum of different identities that were part of it. So our first caucusing meeting was designed to explore leadership. And after completing a short activity, I began asking questions to elicit stories about leadership. And family was the first thing that emerged. Everybody mentioned family, and it came up first and foremost. And in my dissertation, I really used the participants' quotes to tell the story of their collective narrative. Some of them are highlighted here, but there's a lot more richness that's found in the writing and in the dissertation. For example, Quinn told a story about her dad living in a trailer park and through leadership, eventually got out and obtained his PhD. Lauren also shared stories about both of her parents facing economic adversity and persevering. And in their stories, race was never mentioned. Only Apollo alluded to his family's privilege as a result of leadership. His narrative singled out that family were role models, and there is a concrete linkage in the stories about family of leadership to social economic status. And really the underlying message there was that hard work through leadership would yield financial success. They also shared stories about frontier staff and peers. Staff were frequently referenced as the first people who encouraged or challenged or supported them in their development. So I think this is worth noting for some of the folks who are on the call. If you perhaps serve as a staff member, it didn't really pertain to the job responsibilities, but it was just people who had interactions with students and encouraged them to seek out leadership opportunities. And I found this interesting because nobody mentioned anything from high school, such as coaches or teachers or counselors. They didn't even reference any faculty members at Frontier either. Staff were really serving in this outsized role in the saliency of their leadership development. Students and their peers at Frontier were mentioned, but somewhat in a lackluster way. They found peers who only engaged when it would pad their resume, and they weren't interested in that civic virtue of leadership as well. So it was kind of like we tolerate these fellow student leaders who are really only out for their career ambitions. So one of the findings that I came across when we were digging into leadership was a construct, a way of like viewing the world and organizing beliefs. And many of the students were quick to examine it. So in these stories about leadership, which suggested an underpinning philosophy of access to opportunity, Lauren's quote here to the left kind of exemplifies this. She says, "You got to go through some stuff before you know how to take somebody else through it." And in our conversation, we labeled this as a concept of earning leadership. And at the end of the meeting, another participant, Riley, gently pushed back on this idea of earned leadership. And her quote here on the right suggests that there might be more to the equation than just proving your capability of leadership. And all of our subsequent meetings, we'd revisit this concept, and it became an excellent example of how caucusing kind of creates a new narrative. So we may not have had all the answers about earned leadership, but the students began to see there was a different way of looking at these concepts. It was transformative. So during our second meeting, that's when we dug into their stories about being white. And while they were quick to identify privilege, it was seemingly in a textbook manner. It lacked the emotion and personal context that's usually associated with racial discussions. And I almost felt like a professor using like some Socratic method to get answers from pupils. But six narratives emerged in our conversation about race. And as expected, there was some resistance to being white, which I'll explore in depth a little bit later. I was pleasantly surprised to hear stories about unlearning racism, where students sought to examine their own beliefs. And when seeking to find folks who encourage their exploration of privilege, we also stumbled across those who countered those messages, who were mainly families. So there was a lot of resistance about talking and learning about white privilege from family members. And most fascinating to me, we uncovered two constructs embedded in these stories, and I'm going to give more attention to them in a second. This thing that they labeled as the exotic white construct and the voice for the voiceless narrative. The exotic white construct is the idea that one's European heritage is more relevant than race. And then the voice of the voiceless is a common expression, sometimes used among social justice activists who have privilege, but they are using it to perhaps serve oppressed individuals. And both concepts were recognized as problematic during our meetings, but there were still a lot of vestiges of these constructs in the students' thinking, even as we progressed to the third meeting. So some of the findings in the racial narratives, I wanted to take a brief moment to explore some of the forms of resistance that were exhibited by stories and body language. We spent a good amount of time sifting through stereotypes of white people. Two of the participants really chafed at assumptions that all white people were rich or Christian. And they also resisted an idea of having to monitor their language, but felt like people of color could say whatever they wanted. In principle, they had hoped that all white people would be considered and evaluated as individuals and coded by phrases like, you have to get to know someone before blank. Another form of resistance was found in distancing of privilege. As mentioned before, students had a detached articulation of what privilege was, usually straying away from personal connections. And additionally, that exotic white construct that I mentioned before was another form of resistance by distancing from the implications of their racial identity. I highlight these findings because they affirm how white identity development models are no longer suited to address whiteness. Development is no longer characterized by like the outward displays of denial of privilege or identity or the minimization of privilege. Instead, it takes form in these subtle and complex constructs that enable students to just altogether avoid conversations about race. So in order to construct a more meaningful narrative about race, we needed to dig deeper, and this required vulnerability. The vulnerability probably didn't come until about an hour and a half of meeting together when Apollo shared a personal story of being attracted only to white men. And until this point, students had really fixated on examining the macro concepts of privilege rather than their personal connections, and vulnerability was what was needed to get there. So we kind of had a breakthrough there. In our third meeting to discuss the confluences between race and leadership, the group started examining the external again. It started with a discussion about leadership and how leaders are selected at Frontier State University and their recent presidential search. However, this conversation yielded connections between our two other meetings, and their critique of the president. Oh, I'm going to go back just a second. Sorry about that. And in their critique of the presidential search, landing a white male as a president, they realized how earned leadership constructs might be flawed. Candidates of color might have never advanced in that search process despite their qualifications, because the white candidate was probably politically safer for this ruby red rural state. So this upended their earned leadership construct as they started to examine even their own roles, and the conversation took many turns, but they began to stray in their own marginalized identities. They wrestled with how this might provide them an understanding of racial privilege, but also noted how it's different due to visibility. And then finally, they began to uncover the heart of being a white student leader and how it seemed to be normal when you're selected for a leadership position, how they never thought about race unless a person of color was selected instead, and how students of color might be overly burdened in their own leadership roles or tokenized. So this next section in my presentation will dig even deeper into the narratives of these students, exploring some of those coded constructs that I mentioned before and overlaying them with grand or dominant narratives within our own society, and then some of the recommendations that come out of this research. So examining earned leadership, following the same pattern that we did in caucusing, I'd like to address this leadership concept first. And as indicated, this was probably the most pervasive across our three meetings. The students quickly picked up on their own coded language. They said things to indicate their philosophy about leadership. And this concept suggested that you really have to prove yourself with those right qualifications, and these elements constituted somewhat of a social promise or a contract for these students in their minds. So if you worked hard, you deserved opportunity for leadership. And it was a very understandable construct for college students. They're idealistic and driven, and it's designed to reward extracurricular or co-curricular efforts. The conflict in this construct was uncovered when students began to talk about race, like I mentioned. Narratives about race complicated and sometimes negated these beliefs about hard work. And they really bristled at the idea that they may have obtained something because of their race rather than this hard work. And so until these conversations, they may not have considered reality might lie between these two narratives and that they would need to reconcile these beliefs. And this, as a researcher, kind of led me to some of the codes and overlaying them with existing narratives. And I couldn't help but see the connection of this problematic narrative in society, the bootstrap narrative. And it purports that an individual can lift themselves up by their own means, if only by hard work and perseverance. And it's similar to that earned leadership. This narrative completely ignores the confluences of other social identities such as race, and it minimizes some of those systematic barriers, which some might make it nearly impossible for somebody to advance. And Quinn's quote here is a good illustration of how the bootstrap narrative is embedded in their thinking. She references hard work, but also uses the word handed to juxtapose for those who don't work hard for leadership roles. And the connotation of this kind of smacks of the word handout, which is a pejorative label for social programs designed to help those who are disadvantaged. And then this was something we spent a lot of time talking about. I had never heard of this concept, the exotic white construct. And in our discussion, Riley had labeled this phenomenon as we were talking about something, and the coding on this was really clear. So exotic would equate to something that's foreign or uncommon, while white, in their context of race, is considered normal or unimportant. So exotic white is almost a satire of that. And it's really used to distance from some of the white colonial legacy with this racial identity and embrace somewhat of a favorable narrative. So, for example, the students were making fun of people who claimed to be like 2% French and 30% Polish, and they recognized that that was problematic, but in the articulation of some of this, they could understand how some narratives are somewhat favorable. So if you could choose between perhaps this like Georgian plantation owning legacy that you have on one side of your family and a recent immigration from Holocaust survivors, like you might tell that story over one because it minimizes some of that oppression that's part of a white colonial legacy. And so the implications were really clear. It continued to make race a moral issue rather than a systematic or institutional matter, and it conflated racial identity. So this led me to another grand narrative when overlaying some of this data. So here you can see when we're talking about that concept of like the voice for the voiceless that I mentioned before, there's some recognition that you have power in your voice due to a particular identity. And in that, much of their stories represented this desire to use that for beneficial purposes, to perhaps advocate for oppressed individuals. And that reflected a morality in their racial understanding, which then leads to this construct of this white savior narrative, where there's a hero in a story that uses their powers to help people who perhaps can't help themselves. And this is incredibly problematic, and they recognize this in their conversations. But they also had trouble reconciling, well, then what do we do with privilege and how do we navigate some of these things? So in kind of examining some of the confluences here, tensions existed in these coded constructs and grand narratives, and eventually led them to talk about a common narrative that they constructed together of awareness. And this was frequently mentioned in the third caucus that we had. Very seldom did it come up in some of those previous conversations, and they co-constructed it by having these meetings together and talking about these things. Yet, awareness is relative. So what it meant for one student leader in their positions meant something different for another student leader in another context. And so while they had this common understanding of what it was, they would apply it in different ways. And this led us to really kind of the aha moment for a lot of these students in the conversation is when Apollo had this quote that he provided, and he said, "I think good leaders should amplify racial awareness, or good leadership should amplify racial awareness for anyone." And everyone kind of was like, "Whoa," and started talking about what amplification meant and how to perhaps approach that. However, some of those concrete, specific examples of what to do with privilege and the amplification of their leadership through knowledge and awareness were still fairly unclear to students. They did talk about a few examples, but really they still wrestled with that confluence of what it means to be a white student leader. So at this point, I'm going to breeze through some of these things. I realize I've been talking a lot. Some of the implications of this, I created some recommendations really tailored for two audiences from this study: white student leaders themselves and what they can explore in their own leadership and racial identity development. And then also recommendations for folks who are considered leadership educators. And leadership educators could be co-curricular, extracurricular professionals, or it could be a faculty member in the classroom as part of a formalized leadership program. I also talk about potential ideas for future research. I got a lot of questions about this future research as I was doing it, and many students actually sought they would love to explore their own identities and how it pertains to leadership. So people of color, or perhaps other marginalized identities such as sexuality or gender. And then also I have a few reflections that I want to share. The recommendations for some of the student leaders really focused on cutting through some of the barriers that they experienced in this study. So some of the students expressed fear of judgment from their peers if they were to bring up the topic of white privilege and how they're wrestling with that, or how they may have had a racist thought at one point. They also struggle with concepts of resistance and then of course distancing, as I mentioned in some of those constructs. So some of the recommendations that I had were focused on being brave and vulnerable, and also finding those first encouragers in different places on campus that you could perhaps unpack your white privilege, with also not placing that burden of education on either students, peers, or faculty and staff of color. So really seeking some of these similar spaces emulated from this study for white students to unpack with fellow white students or other white mentors to understand their privilege. And then also some recommendations for either first encouragers or some of those staff that might be leadership educators is adopting caucusing for learning. Caucusing is a multifaceted tool that can be used for research, but also some of the identity exploration that I've mentioned before. There's a lot of research out there actually in a co-curricular context that supports using caucusing for learning. It can also be used in the classroom, and there's a few articles about that. And then also like encouraging staff or faculty to be a first encourager, to challenge white students to unpack their privilege. It's sometimes an awkward topic to breach, but it's so incredibly important if you have a relationship with a student to be able to do that. And then some of the considerations for future research include caucusing with students of color. And I'm actually in the process of launching a study with some colleagues to explore that, because that was a question that I frequently encountered in this study from students of color. They're like, well, I would like to do something like this too. And then also social media and the influence on the white identity. So that was something that came up in our study. People mentioned Tumblr and all sorts of different platforms about how they found different communities to explore white identity. And I think that's a double-edged sword in many ways. Like there's some radicalization out there too. And then further exploring the influence of family in identity development and exploring more caucusing as a research method. So this study was particularly impactful for me because it's led to a number of different things, that some self-discoveries in my own life, and then also some things that I can incorporate in my professional context as well. So one of them is, after the completion of this dissertation, at this institution, I was invited to host a workshop to be able to explore what it means to be a white leader in a staff or faculty context at an institution, and also have an understanding of how white privilege factors into their leadership styles. I've also adapted the dissertation for publication purposes and presentation. And then, like I mentioned before, certainly working on some new research avenues to help contribute to a greater understanding of how race influences leadership. Okay, I've talked a lot right now. And so I hope that you've enjoyed some of this, but I want to leave some time in case you have questions or critiques or any thoughts about this research or presentation. Don't be shy. If anyone has a question, I'd love to talk about this.